Hello folks, and today we're looking at different scales toy train. We have O, as a lot of you probably know. We have O130, which is the narrow gauge train to O gauge. Should be O130. We have toy trains that are tin plate, so these are like as toy as a toy train gets. We have HO trains, we have more HO trains. We have N-scale trains. We have more HO trains. So I figured we'd start off with O gauge, being it's the oldest toy train scale. And you don't think I don't have post-war O gauge trains, I do. I have some probably older than that somewhere. But yeah, so we'll start off with O gauge. It runs on a 3-rail gauge, or a 3-rail track. So it's, 3 rails. It's also, compared to N-scale and HO, it runs on AC. Except for this one, it's DC. It must have been a strange year for being an O gauge train if your train runs on DC. And then you have the next one. These are really cool looking, though it's not entirely scale. ON30. This is the only O130 train I have. There's a train show coming up. I might try to get O130. More O130, maybe some freight cars or passenger cars, whatever I can find that will run with this, and hopefully not find any O130 and get that mixed up. But then again, it won't be the end of the world because I want to get O130 too. So, O130 is a great train because, again, O130 runs on HO track, so if you have HO trains like I do, you can buy this, and it runs on HO track, runs on the same voltage, 100% compatible. It's great for Christmas as well. So, some of the backing story, though, on the camera, the backing story to O130 is quite strange. Let's take a look at the crazy scale of O130. O130 is actually a European gauge, because European trains have a lot of 24-inch gauge, 30-inch gauge. They have a lot of different gauges compared to Americans. We have 2 main gauges. Standard gauge, 4 feet, 8.5 inches. Narrow gauge, 36 inches or 3 feet. For a narrow gauge locomotive like this, it would actually be running on O130. O130 stands for O scale narrow gauge 3 foot. This is O130. It means O scale narrow gauge 30 inch, making this 6 inches smaller in gauge than it should be, which also explains why when you put, if you have O scale track and you have O scale trains running, this track looks significantly smaller, and it looks more like half the size versus, closer to, like, it's a little bit shy, being at 36 inches of a third of the gauge. It's closer actually to a quarter, but you get the idea. So the locomotives, basically everything's scale, cab scale, boilers scale, running board pistons, everything's scale, except for when you flip it on its side and you realize that's an HO scale gauged chassis and axle. I mean, you can't see the axles on the gyres, but you can on the pilot truck, so, yeah. We'll eventually do a video on that model I'm looking at, but yeah. So now let's talk about a toy train that can't get any more toy train-like if you possibly can. This is Marx. This is a Marx O gauge train. If you don't know what Marx O gauge trains is, it's a cheaper O gauge train of the time. They're no longer around, sadly. Otherwise, I probably have a whole ton of it. But they went out of business a long time ago. But they made these semi-scale toy-like, as toy-like can be, trains. They made wind-ups, electrics, you name it. They pretty much made it, and they're just basically toys. And this one's really neat because you can see it's all banged up, which means more than likely a kid enjoyed this train and had a good time with it. So now we move on to HO, which, in case you don't know, stands for half O, and to prove it, the 2 different tracks that I have laid out here for you is exactly half the size. And just to prove it, the two different tracks I have here are exactly half the size. This is HO, this is O gauge. HO stands for half O. So, you know, all kind of makes sense. This is a Tyco, and yeah, so perks about O gauge, you can buy scale models, you can buy more toy train like models like this. This is like a semi-scale model. You can get a lot of narrow gauge equipment to go with it, even if it's not quite the same scale gauge. You can also get very toy-like trains, and HO, this is about as toy-like as it gets, besides that little porter. Oh. So yeah, and then we have this little porter, which you can see up front, it's half the size, about. You gotta remember, these aren't, I don't think these two are scale models. But one thing with HO, they're nice because they fit into smaller spaces. And also, for being such small models, they have a lot of detail. In fact, there doesn't really pick it up. You can see this is die cast underneath, but that's nice because it has the weight. You can see all the fine detail underneath it. And HO is also one of my favorite scales, particularly because it's one of the for one, it's the most popular, so it's not really surprised that it's one of my favorites. But it's a nice scale because it's not too big, it's not too small, it's just right. Also, another thing is you see a lot more scale railroads. I mean, for one, it's pretty obvious. You know, you have 3 rail, 2 rail. Which one's more realistic? That's pretty obvious. I mean, you also have that same perk, though, with HO. But then there's also downfalls, of course, with having 2 rail track. You can't insulate 1 rail and have the wheels carry the power over because it's only 2 rails. Versus O gauge, you can insulate rails, and yeah, there's perks. But O gauge is more so designed as a toy, and HO is a scale model. And that's exactly pretty much all you find for the most part. This might be scale, this might not. I'm not sure. Leave down in the comments if it is. But yeah, so that's just the perks of HO. They're more of a scale model. They're great to be weathered because, as you can see, I didn't do this, but someone has weathered this and just gives a nice weathered look. It gives kind of the appearance that it's been scratched up like a real boxcar would be. Yeah, so yeah. So then this brings on to N scale. This is, you know, about the half the size of HO. These are really neat models and have a lot of detail. For being how small they are, they're quite detailed. Everything's really small in them. And I like to point this out, especially if you like to fix your own trains. On Bachmann HO and N scale, now I'm looking at this, their chassis, I've pulled a Bachmann apart before, and it's just a split chassis that basically locks in the motor, and your motor sits somewhere in here, and then you have 2 flywheels, and then you have electricity being picked up from one wheel on one half of the chassis, and then the chassis split down the center, it's isolated. Then you have power coming on from the inside, and then it comes on from the sides of the motor. And then you have the flywheels, and you have the drive chain that goes into the bogies. So that's just a quick brief on how these work. A lot of Bachmanns are about the same. Tyco, it picks up in the front or back sometimes, and then it just brings it to a pancake motor in the back. So I have another pancake motor locomotive. It's made by Bachmann, similar design. And if this one I can't get running, I might be able to get the brushes and pancake motor from it. And if this one has bad gears, I have a whole lot of Bachmann gears. Whether or not they'll work to you guys, another question, but they're both, back then, they're toy train manufacturers that kind of made them kind of generic. Just to say, they weren't generic with the parts that they use. Like, they would use generic hardware, you know, one size fits all screws and all that. So, yeah. And just, availability-wise, we won't go into that, but there's a lot of different manufacturers. And then there's another scale that's about half the size of N, and then Z-scale. Z-scale, yeah. I wanted to get into that, but when I found out genuinely how small N scale is, I was like, well, that's what I thought Z scale was. I'm sticking with the N for a small scale. And that's another perk about N scale. With a big O gauge train, it fits on a little bit over a 2-foot table, but those curves look like a toy train. Like a circle, it fits on probably safely a 2.5 foot by 2.5 foot table for a circle, but it looks like a toy train circle. With N scale, you can fit on the same size table, but because of the size difference, it actually looks identical. It looks more prototypical. So that's some of the perks in like HO. This is an 18 radius. I've always felt more comfortable with 4 foot with HO with an 18 radius. I think there's a 15. But 15 for me is just too tight unless you're running small stuff like the Porter. Maybe I don't know, caboose with it. But if you're running some bigger rolling stock like bigger hoppers, I'll show you like the Burlington Northern one. That one's gonna be a bit more. It's not gonna appreciate a 15 radius curve. I have some other freight that's not gonna really like that. I'm not even sure if the diesel the F9 Conrail engine would like that. I don't think really anything likes that. So, there's a lot of different stuff along that line. So, yeah. So, that pretty much wraps it up for today's video. As always, thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe. Leave a comment down below. Subscribe for the 50 subscribers special. As always, see you on the rails.